Randy Green here, and welcome to the course Keeping the Psychic Energetic Balance. This is a little introduction, and I want to begin this introduction with some philosophical thoughts. And we have talked about in the two prior courses, we have talked about some psychological levels of the work, and we have discussed mindfulness and Buddhism. And in all systems of thought and in self-investigating systems, whatever they may be, there are the big questions that we kind of call existential questions. And that is normally covered either by religion or philosophy. And you can say, in a way, Buddhism bridges in between the two. The original Buddhist systems of thought did actually not see themselves as religion. That came later on. It was for those who are what we call hardcore Theravada Buddhist, they call it a philosophy. And I tend to agree in that manner, because in many ways you can say a religion kind of demands a god or gods. And technically there are none in the Buddhism ideas, although the later versions of them, as we find it in Tibetan Buddhism, as well as the later forms of Buddhism that kind of merged with some of the Hindu ideas, kind of gave in patrons, and which later became closer and closer to what we would call a sort of deities. And that's typically what we call within Buddhism. It's the Mahayana, the big vessel, that is for the commoners, whereas the small vessel is for the monks and the really serious practitioners of Buddhism, because that's how I'm going to put it. So in that way, the original Buddhist thoughts had very little to do with some kind of creator. And I like to push us in that direction, because if we work within what we call New Age or the spiritual system, then you have, whether you define it as God or source, it goes very, very close to a type of religion. And we also see that in the Alice A. Bailey material. She also works with the planetary logos as this huge male figure that is controlling everything and creating everything out of himself. And we are his children as part of his grand vessel, which is the planet and the solar system. Although the solar system is the solar logos, and therefore our planetary logos is the lesser brother of the solar logos, which is an even bigger type of deity, if you like, because that is how it is presented. And we come to the existential questions of why we do anything. What is the purpose and the meaning of whatever we're doing? It often ends up in this whole matter of what we could call either philosophy or psychology, the existential questions, or religion. And those of you who are familiar with my background, you know I've studied Buddhism, and I have also a very clear memory of actually a past life as a Buddhist monk. And at the same time, I also have a bachelor degree in theology. So I have actually for 4 years, more or less 4 years, studied the system of thoughts behind Christianity, behind the Hebrew Bible, the area when it was developed, and the era where it was developed, an area where it was developed as well, and how church history has developed from then and until now, as well as how the belief systems within Christianity, which also goes with the big father, the grandfather, and his son, which he sacrificed for the releasement or the redemption of humanity, which is, of course, in my opinion, dates back to some of the older Jewish systems of thoughts that actually went with a sacrifice of the firstborn, which it's literally in the Hebrew Bible. You find very ancient text where there was a practice of sacrificing your firstborn child, literally, often a son. And then later on, it was made into a sacrifice of an animal. And this is what was brought into the temple culture. So we have some traits going back in the history of the people around the area, which we now call Israel. At that time, it was called something else, but it dates back to very ancient traditions that kind of goes with the idea of sacrifice to release what we call the sin of the many, which we also, in different versions of how we interpret the figure Christ as the sacrificial lamb, which is also Jewish practice, which is what Pesach actually is about, sacrificing the lamb to avoid death to come and take the firstborns, which we see in the Exodus story of the Ivrites or the Hebrews that left Egypt or Mitzrayim and traveled and were released because death, the angel of death, Azazel, walked the streets of what we call the Pharaoh, the city of Pharaoh, and all the firstborn sons were slain in that one, except from the firstborn sons of the Jews, which because they had sacrificed, sorry about that, a lamb, and smeared the blood of the lamb on the doorposts, which we also see as part of Jewish tradition. They were then allowed to be set free. After that one, there was the last trial. You can say we had Aaron fighting the Pharaoh using different forms of magic, always proving to be better. We have had the 10 plagues. And the last part of all of this was the death of the firstborn sons in Egypt or Mitzrayim, which then allowed the Hebrews the Pharaoh literally said, go, because your God is clearly stronger than mine. So leave. So, sorry about that. With that, I understand it's part of Jewish tradition. And since we know that the figure, Jesus, whether he is authentic or not, whether what we have left of him in the Gospels, which are a type of biographies that were written at the time, which were very normal, this weaving in historical facts and artificial histories and made up histories and hearsay and people say, and then the author himself, or herself, by the way, would create a story which would then be called a biography, that were telling a tale, a narrative from which there were points to be understood, from where there were new perspectives of reality to be perceived, a new type of meaning with life, which is what the Gospels are made for. So we can't really say that they are 100% accurate. And to be completely honest, the scholars that are not under the spell of the Bible, so to speak, they're not religious, are looking at this and say, well, probably the only thing that is what we can say is leading back to something we can say could have been something Jesus said. Is exactly in the sayings. The rest is a made-up story to put a context to these different types of sayings, and these sayings going with the German word for it called Quelle, or the source of this information. Okay. So that is kind of just to give a little bit of background, so you don't get this whole, those of you who might have roots into some kind of understanding of this, because it runs in our subconscious. There's absolutely no doubt that those of us in the Western world, we are subconsciously driven to some degree by these ideas and system of thoughts that has run the Western world for quite some time, as long as Christianity has existed. And in that story, there also goes with this, as we go back to Egypt and understands there, and the many of the Hebrews that technically left Egypt never came to the promised land, because they were taken out by the wrath of God already before they even got there, including Moses that never got there, because he also kind of, the God or the God of Moses and Aaron kind of got a little bit pissed on Moses due to some of the things he didn't do or did do. I can't remember, but he never got into the promised land. Only Aaron did, and the ones that survived with Aaron, and they became the new priesthood. So this is just a little bit of background of that one. But what is in that understanding is that the God of the Old Testament is this wrathful, revenging type of God. And the God that we are presented with in the Gospels are this caring, loving God that could never, ever do anything revenging over humanity other than actually killing his own son so that humans could be released of the original sin from the Garden of Eden, creating a neat loop back into allowing humans, if they did the right thing, they would get back into heaven, and that's the Garden of Eden. And if they did the wrong things, they would end up in hell or Gomorrah or what is called yes, it is. It's called something else in not Gomorrah, but it's called something else in the Hebrew, I think it's Gesana or something, I can't remember, but the Hebrews had their version of hell as well, but not the one we are presented with in Christianity. That's more similar to what we have experienced in the Sumerian mythology, to put it, with demons and weird creatures. But we see this all around the planet, that there are, even in Hindu mythology, there are these 7 planes of existence beneath humans, and there are also planes of suffering there, where certain humans will be dragged in due to their karma and what they have done while living on this planet. So it's a cultural thing we find in all systems of thoughts around the planet. And of course, as a scholar, you can say it's because people have influenced each other with these ideas, or we could actually say perhaps there is something about it. We don't really know. We know the Greeks also had Thanatos and the whole, which is their version of death. And he was running, not just Hades is another version of it, but the earlier version is Tartanos. That's what's called in Greek, where the gods sent the ones they were displeased with into eternal torment. And that is similar to some of the ideas we actually have from in Babylon as well. But of course, they were communicating with each other. These were trade nations, and there were merchants and travelers that traveled between the different cities and trading goods and services, as well as telling tales and sharing their understanding of reality, of course. So there has been a lot of sharing of information. And then there was this idea as well at the time that perhaps the gods were not that different. We have different language, we have different cultures, but perhaps the gods are the same because the stories kind of seem similar, don't they? So perhaps the god in Babylon were the same type of god you would find, that Marduk would be the same as Zeus and so forth. And that is some of the syncretism that happened at the same time. And we actually have a huge political leader, Alexander the Great, who actually tried to create a common religion because he saw these traits as well. But he died very young, which we have heard before, that the ones that are really trying to stir up the world order, they have a tendency to leave the scene quite early before they even get to that. He did conquer a lot of land, though, but when he was really to become the great ruler and touch religion, well, that's kind of where he died. And we can always question, did he die naturally or of a disease, or, as it was quite common at the time, did someone poison him? Okay. But what I want to go with here is this whole understanding of the meaning of life. Because when we begin to talk about why we should develop ourselves, we can say that there are many good reasons for this, and I'm already touched ground with it, and it all depends on what level we are working with. But when we work our way back into the higher order science, it is important that we, in a way, test ourselves for our belief system on this matter. Is it because we are afraid of dying? Or is it because we believe in reincarnation? Or is it because we believe in a vengeful God and we are afraid of ending up in hell? Or is it because we are afraid of the unknown and therefore we want something to cling on to, we can control, so we psychologically can feel more safe in a comfort zone, as in, if I do this, I know that whatever comes after my life will be something that is okay with me, that I can kind of find myself being part of? Or is it the fear that there's absolutely nothing after this life, that this is just, we get born and we live and we die and there's nothing before, there's nothing after. It's just a biological circus of life that arises and lives and then dies out. And the only reason why we're here to get as much as possible out of this single life, having children to bring forward to the species, and as a biological imperative. And then everything else is what we make it into. This is kind of what you could call a more scientific angle on the same thing. And it kind of goes a little bit with the Big Bang theory, as that before Big Bang, there was nothing. And after Big Bang, the big crunch, then there will be nothing. So that's the same system of thought. So we're seeing that humans, again, as Alexander the Great and other people at that time, 2,500, 3,000 years ago, as well as now, are discovering and seeing the commonalities between the different systems of thought, that there are things that are very much alike. And the question is not that that makes it true, but actually the more question is why, and that is what Carl Gustav Jung tried to explore, and that's where he came up with the collective unconscious, where he said all of these myths, religion myths, and ideas that humans have, they stem from this soup of what our ancestors have thought and felt as well. And whenever we get born, it's part of our makeup. It's part of our biological or cellular memory that we have these mythologies or traits of belief regarding ourselves and the world and the planet, from where we organize our own lives, especially when we begin to talk psychology and the meaning of life. We will then, all according to our composition, so to speak, dive back into some of these collective systems of thoughts and ideas. Some have more traits for religious role models or archetypes, as Jung called it, and others will seek more into what we call esoteric ways. Therefore, he also studied Kundalini yoga and other more what we call Eastern perceptions of religious ideas and systems of thought. And I've kind of done the same journey to find some of the answers. And what Jung kind of came up with was that we have to have our own myth, but our myth must take its footing within the culture we live in. It must be part of our, what we could call, where we are born, links us up to that subconscious imaginary reality that is roaming around in our subconscious. That means that if we are born, as me, for instance, in Denmark, it will not make much sense for me to work with the Kala chakra system, which is kind of a Tibetan system of thought, or Hinduism for that matter. I can convert, of course, but when we talk about the subconscious and working with the archetypes and unfolding our subconscious into an understanding that fits our internal structure, then it must be within our culture and it must be within the religious systems that are running our culture subconsciously. And once you have understood this and you have read a little bit about Jung, you will see I am quite influenced by Jung and his ideas, and I absolutely believe that he was on to something. When it comes to Carl Gustav Jung and I read his biography, I think it's saddening that he didn't dare to take the step, because he tells that he had a lot of vision as a child. And he grew up in a very, what we call a strange home with a lot of poltergeists. And his sister was a medium and she could pull in a lot of very interesting stuff. And he was trying, as I kind of see it, he was probably trying to find answers for this in his psychological work. And at the same time, he was also trying very hard to get himself acknowledged as a scientist. And therefore he had limitations to what he could actually put out there. So in honor of that one, I will kind of say, well, Jung, you work with the collective subconscious. So let us investigate what that is and go the step deeper, which I did. So, and many have done within spiritual systems, but I'm saying the reason why I'm putting this in here is because when we talk spiritual systems, that are now conglomerate of different ideas thanks to the esoteric communities, Theosophy and Blavatsky and Bailey, where they merged Tibetan Buddhism as well as Theravada Buddhism, as well as Hinduism, as well as Christianity, and called it the ageless wisdom, again, running on this subcurrent of that humanity has had the same ideas. It's just up to whoever and whatever we are to interpret this source of information from which our capacities and our mental orientation will then interpret what we are investigating. Jung said the same thing. I completely agree with that. But remember, Jung had also studied Kundalini Yoga and Kala Chakra probably, and he had his own alchemy traits and we're diving into mysticism as well. So to go a little bit beyond that, I have investigated, for instance, the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism that goes into a completely different setup. But again, orchestrated by different forms of not divinities, but here angels. But angels were the creation of the all-known prime mover, as Aristotle called the source of everything, which is what we see in the attempt to get New Age out of the religious shackles, is to call it the source of everything, which is a Greek philosophy, as we saw it with Aristotle, that called it the prime mover, the one that puts everything in motion, the source of everything there is. So it's just, we're repeating the same ideas, and since people are not studying philosophy, I did, because as part of my bachelor degree, and you also know I am a licensed psychotherapist, and my education during these 3 years were all about the existentialism, the meaning of life, the psychological angle to existentialism. So all of this is, of course, affecting me, including having past life memories. So for me, there's absolutely no doubt that there are life before this and life after that. But when it comes into the different challenges I gave myself in my journey of self-discovery and what I actually believed in, I began with Christianity because of my grandfather. And as him, I let it behind because it was not really coherent enough for me. It has never made sense to me why God sacrificed his only child, if that was the case, because it's brutal, and you have this church with a man hanging on a cross bleeding. Should that redeem me, that God sacrificed his own son? On the contrary, for me, it's a kind of male raw power, as if you don't do what you're told, you will end up there on the cross, or you get tormented in hell. And that never really rang well with me. And it didn't push me into Vicar or the female pagan ideas either, with the Great Mother and Mother Gaia. That never felt real to me either, because I had already been spoiled by Jung and Freud, for that matter. Not that I'm okay with Freud, because he was a crack addict, but he was onto some ideas. And one of the things he definitely said, which I also, when I was younger, I studied Karl Marx. So religions for the masses, remember? So what I kind of came out of this is, as I agree with Jung also saying, is that whenever we have these paternal religions where you have a father figure, or maternal religions where you have a mother figure, these are often psychological projections of the all-caring mother or the all-caring father. And in the Gospels, you can say that the wrathful God has been turned into this all-caring, loving God, and he's doing everything by love. And at the same time, he's slicing the throat of his own son, sending him into enormous torment and torture and crucifying him. This is cognitive dissonance. But it has a purpose. It has a purpose of love can be within punishment as well. That love can come from suffering, which then sparked to life a lot of martyrs in the first century after the crucifixion, if we believe in that one, or the execution, which I am more, because the earliest text said that Jesus, the rabbi, was hung on a tree, and that would be part of the torment, and then eventually he would die out of thirst or what have you. I don't know. We don't have any clear knowledge of this, other than it was in what we call the reception of this, was later on made into the crucifixion, because that was, people were beginning to see this as a vision of Christ being crucified and then risen in this huge bulb of light, the transfiguration, as in all that we're doing this sacrifice, and this sacrificing, bleeding for God, would then go through this transfiguration via pain, which we're seeing in some of the monks later on that were living very, very strictly, and at the same time were also punishing themselves, both emotional but also corporal. And we see this in the Saint of Francis of Assisi. And we see this in Teresa of Avila, for instance, where we have these martyrs that are having all sorts of stigmata of bleeding hands and all sorts of very, very torment in many ways and forms, as well as the torment in hell, which is also about that you rise to the occasion, literally, through torment. You go through suffering and pain, and by that you will be redeemed. That will be, your sins will be redeemed through this pain, through this type of crucifixion, or whatever that means in life. And you will go through the same steps as the Father's firstborn Son did to redeem yourself. So he showed the path from where we will all get back into heaven, or get back into the Garden of Eden. And Bailey runs on that ideas as well in these different ways of, when we talk about astrology and the different crosses in astrology that defines, we have the cardinal, we have the fluctuant, and we have the fixed cross that kind of defines how hard our life is going to be. I'm just putting this in because this idea of torment and punishment and to get the true love is in psychologically speaking really unbalanced. And when we do this work, we need to investigate ourselves where are we on that spectrum of ideas of purpose and meaning of why we're doing this? Do we subconsciously have some of these suffering traits that goes with some of the more what we call darker sides of Christianity? Or do we have only the love and light perspective of it, where Jesus was this caring, compassionate figure, which again indicates that people have not read the Gospels, but they're working with the archetype of the compassionate Christ that goes around and heal people. I've not really read the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus gets really pissed, and he gets pissed at his disciples, and he's driving out demons, and he is tearing the temple apart. He has got a temper, that man. And so that is absolutely not this archetype that has been made later on, which of course, in my opinion, had a purpose as well. That is the transfigured Jesus. You're seeing this one that is all complete in balance and complete zen, and this huge capacity that is sitting at his Father's right hand, and are spreading his joy towards humanity, creating this huge field of energy, which St. Paul were teaching his Christians about, becoming part of Christ through the Eucharist, through the different ways of living, through the forgiveness of your sins, through the church, and these kind of all rituals that were made of to make people part of the body of Christ, from where they would undergo the same torment and the same redemption, and by that be transfigured when they died, and that would lead them into heaven. So this is important understanding when we talk about some of the subconscious ideas that are driving us. Where I want to go with this is that when we talk about why we do this, it is important to understand that there are reasons why this religion became so prosperous. And I'm talking a bit about that in modern history and many other places where there were different developmental programs. And these developmental programs were made to clear out the infection, the original quote unquote sin, which creates ill-mindedness. And we're seeing that exemplified in the Genesis, where the first book, or the first book of Moses, if you want to do it the Hebrew way, where you have the Adam and Eve that were in the Garden of Eden, and Eve let the snake convince her that it was okay to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge so that she would know more. And she said, no, I can't do that because the Lord has told me that I'm not allowed to do so. And I will die if I do so. He will smear me to death. And the snake says, you will not die. You will surely not die, which is a bad translation because what the snake is actually saying, you will not die. So that means both soul and spirit body, soul and spirit. And at that time, it was not a trinity. It was just because it was in the Garden of Eden. So it was just kind of in the light body, which some rabbis believe is how Adam and Eve actually looked in the Garden of Eden, and their original ruach, which is what they came to life with, the divine sparkle, so to speak. So that's where that idea comes from, the divine breath. You see it in all mythologies that humans come to life because the gods either breathe into their nostrils, give them part of the divine breath, ruach, or it's part of what we could call a spark of life that is given to them somehow, somewhere, whether it's part of some humans were made in the Babylonia, some of the mythologies there in Sumerian ideas. Babylonia is the later city that were part of the Sumerian or Mesopotamian continent. But the not continent, but area. As far back as we go, some of the mythology there also talks that humans were created out of dirt and the blood of some female goddesses that made humans come to life and be the slaves of the gods. Again, all depending on what type of mythology we're talking about. We're seeing it with the Aboriginals. We're seeing it many different places around the continent, that humans come to life because they have something of the gods in them. And either whether it's blood or the breath of God, this sparkle, this little light thing that is in us is what creates what we could call life as we know of it as a human. So we are in that manner part of God because we are made out of some substance of the God, whether it's the breath, the ruach, which kind of goes with the Greeks thought about this as well as a kind of nous knowledge, or it is actually the blood, which kind of gives it a little bit more tangible, making humans really literally made out of the same material as the gods. And we are also seeing that in the first book of Genesis, or the first book of Moses, where where it is said that the gods made humans in their image, so to speak. So there are similarities there, but there are two stories in the Hebrew Bible, or in the first book of Genesis, which Genesis is Greek and means in the beginning. Genesis, the beginning, where something gets made, and that's the creational story. In Hebrew, it's also called in the beginning, so that's why the Greek translation is made that way. I'm not going to go into all of these translation issues and is it actually what's said there, but there, of course, we can have a lot of very long discussions of how to translate the Hebrew Bible, because it was, just to give a short understanding of this, it was actually made in Egypt, interesting enough, by the Jewish communities there. And they wrote it in Greek to begin with because their oral teachings were getting lost. So they wrote it down in Greek, and that's called the Septuaginta. And then later on, when the Hebrews began, when they lost the temple, they had the synagogues, and then they needed to recreate this in their original Hebrew language to keep their ethnicity, so to speak. And by that, they back translated some of the Greek Bible, literally the Septuaginta, into Hebrew. So we can again discuss, is that actually what was taught in the temple? And there is a huge difference between the Jewish temple culture as well as we see it in the older versions of some of the parts of the Hebrew Bible, as well as the later synagogue way of working with the divine being, which then stopped being a god you sacrifice to, but actually being a God from where you follow the Torah or the path of life, from where you will It's interesting because the Jews don't work with an afterlife, but you are living to follow the path of God because that is what you do. He made you. You're part of his covenant. So you do as he says. That's the Torah. You follow his bidding. You follow his laws because he made you. So this is the payback, so to speak. You show your honor to the God that created you by he gave you his ruach, his spirit of life, and you follow his Torah to honor that bidding, just to put it into context as well. So there are people that are religious without leading to an afterlife. So what I wanted to go with was years ago, aside from the Christianity thing that I kind of left behind, even though I was for quite some time working with the archetype of Jesus and why he had to die. Why was he crucified? It puzzled me ever since I was a kid and my grandfather took me to church. I was looking at that crucified man. I was thinking, why? It absolutely made no sense to me that a God that preaches love would sacrifice his child. Why was a blood sacrifice necessary? And technically, even though I work with it, what we call in contemplation and meditation, trying to understand this, which is what Buddhist monks do as well, they contemplate on difficult questions to find the answers within. And this is something the martyrs have been doing as well. The later Christian martyrs during the Middle Ages, they were also mystics. They were getting answers from within, which is technically what we call the trait of a mystic, is that he or she is able to contemplate and get answers from within, including visions. And in that search for answers, the difficult questions is what you can say, what has kept Christianity alive, because it is cognitive dissonance. Everything in it is creating these questions. So therefore you're never given the straight answers, as you see in some of the polytheistic religions where you have many gods that are taking care of different features of the human life. You see that in Egypt, you see that in India, you see that in many places. This is what you call more ancient type of religion that is also very nature-based, polytheistic, many gods that are overseeing the human life in all of its aspects, whatever that is. And if you are to get a good birth, you pray to that god or goddess and onward and so forth. So you have these rituals that are connected to your life as a human being, not because you're paying tribute, so to speak, to the God that created you, as we see it in Judaism, but because they are the ones that are administering the world you're living in, and you're part of that. So you better appease the gods and have their goodwill. Otherwise you'll end up in the underworld. You're seeing all of these ideas are mixed up in the later religions, which is a little bit sad though, but it came with the creation of later types of politics where the king needed to be, quote unquote, the son of God, and literally administer that power within the earth realm, saying, I can claim this city because I am the son of God, which they called themselves, and the pharaohs called themselves that as well. And we saw that in Babylonia as well. Their names indicated the moment they got crowned and they became the king, they became the son of God, and the priesthood anointed them as the king of God. The son of God, but the king elected by God by being the son of God. Again, with the firstborn, which is why queens or firstborn children within these different nobilities or kingdom lineages, if the firstborn was a daughter, she would never inherit the throne. This is something that came very, very much later on, as we saw it in England, but it was always the firstborn son. So if there were no sons that were born, then would go to a cousin or something else. Again, the firstborn that would inherit the kingdom, that would inherit the estate or what have you. Anyways, just putting that in context as well. So this came with this this claim of Jesus being the son of God is actually, this is some of the things, the pun that is in when he's getting trialed by the Romans is, are you the king of the Jews? Are you anointed the forthcoming king? Because if you are, then you are politically dangerous to us, and therefore we are allowed to execute you. And the trial showed that he was not, and then they handed him over to the Jews and said, well, then it's within the religious matter, and that is up to you to see if he's actually allowed to call himself the son of God without actually claiming the kingdom, which is not of this earth, but beyond, as St. Paul also said. But that he is claiming to be the newborn Adam, so to speak, because Adam was the firstborn of God, remember, and he was a little bit of a chicken. So again, so this is again, so the Redeemer is the one that brings people back into the Garden of Eden, and that is the kingdom of heaven, and that's not the kingdom on our earth. And this is again this weird division that is in Christianity. So for Christians, the whole game is to get into heaven, and the way that they go there always seemed messy to me, and it did not make sense, probably because I had past lives leaving the church. I remember leaving the church where I discovered that the church were run by greedy priests, and that is what Luther also discovered, and he tried to make it into something else. So there are again these different historical traits that we find within our own history. So therefore you can say, well, was that the reason why I chose Buddhism? We can't say that. But after having just re-understood this understanding that the church was not really for me, Christianity was not really for me, and I just tied the bow on that one doing the bachelor degree in theology, where I really said, well, now I see why I don't feel it intuitively. It doesn't work for me completely. After studying it for 4 years, like in its original language, within its original context, it made sense to me. And then I could leave it behind and put it to bed and say, now I know why. Now I know why it's not appealing to me. And then, of course, I moved into spirituality. And here I will leave this introduction part number 1 and move into a second video. Thank you.